Athens, one of the world's oldest cities and the cradle of European civilization. The Greek capital is regarded as the birthplace of democracy in classical times. Today, the Hellenic Republic, as Greece is officially known, is an integral member of the European Union. But the path to democracy in the modern era was paved with violence and terror. In 1967, the Greek military staged a coup and established a dictatorship.
They had tanks on their side. They were a small group of officers who had decided to seize power, and it came as a complete surprise.
The military exiled their opponents to remote islands.
Thousands were arrested in the first week alone. The military used torture.
Here we can be heard, he said, but there are other places they won't hear you.
Public offices and universities were purged of critics, their posts filled by army officers and loyal supporters. A brutal military dictatorship in free Western Europe, in a country that was a member of NATO. How did that happen? Athens in the night of April 21, 1967. The streets were deserted. The city was still asleep. Greek parliamentary elections were only a few days away. At 2 a.m., tanks began rolling through the streets of Athens. Even before dawn, the strategically most important places had been seized. They included the broadcasting center, the defense ministry, and parliament. It was a military coup planned and carried out by a small group of officers. Even though they only held the rank of colonel, they enjoyed the support of a number of generals. The key figures among the plotters were Colonel Georgios Papadopoulos, Brigadier Stylianos Patakos, and Colonel Nikolaos Makaresos. Even before daybreak, every member of the government had been arrested, including Prime Minister Panagiotis Kanellopoulos and centrist politician Georgios Papandreou, who was favorite to become Greece's new Prime Minister. The head of Greece's parliamentary monarchy was King Constantine II. At just 26, he had little political experience. At his palace near Athens, he too was surprised by the coup. In the early morning hours, the three leaders of the conspiracy gained access to the young monarch and demanded that they be given the power to govern. Constantine let himself be intimidated and reluctantly agreed.
The mistake the young king made that night was to think that he would still be able to control the colonels later, but because he failed to react, even those members of the military who were not behind the coup gave the junta free rein.
By morning, the colonels had positioned more tanks throughout the city center. A radio announcement was made.
Λόγω της δημιουργηθήσης εκρήθμου καταστάσεως, από του Μεσονικτίου ο στρατός ανέλαβε την διακυβέρνηση της χώρας.
We awoke to the terrible news that all the articles of the Constitution had been suspended and that martial law had been declared. This was accompanied by the warning that anyone still out on the streets after sunset could be shot.
The last free edition of the national daily, Katimirini, was headlined, "Athens occupied by the military, members of the government arrested." Henceforth, freedom of the press belonged to the past. After hours of negotiations, by the late afternoon, the king had sworn in a new government. 5 officers with the rank of colonel now held key positions in the new cabinet. The regime of the colonels was born. Colonel Georgios Papadopoulos was appointed defense minister. He was the leading figure and face of the junta. Together with Stylianos Patakos and Nikolaos Makaresos, he formed the core of the regime. In parliament, Papadopoulos justified the military coup.
Η κατάσταση αυτή προστιθεμένη εις μίαν αναρχική αντίληψη η οποία είχε επιβληθεί σχεδόν εις όλα τα άτομα της κοινωνίας, είχε δημιουργήσει τον έσχατον κίνδυνο να αλωθεί η χώρα από τον κομμουνισμό.
An imminent coup planned by communist conspirators? That was a downright lie from the colonels. But Papadopoulos used fears of a communist coup and compared Greece to a patient who needed surgery for his own good. Throughout Greece, even in the first few days, thousands of leftist opposition figures were arrested. Among them, politicians, journalists, lawyers, and artists. The military were able to fall back on comprehensive lists which had been kept for years by the secret police. One of the names the military found was that of Adam Dragas. Aged 25 at the time, Dragas was arrested only 2 days after the coup.
At some time in the night, around 1 o'clock, they put us on a warship. We had no idea where we were going or what they planned to do with us. We were scared. Some pessimists among us thought we'd be tossed into the sea. The conditions were indescribable, inhuman. 650 people all crowded together. Some had serious injuries. But the worst thing of all was the uncertainty. It was only when the prow was opened that we saw where they'd brought us. There was this barren landscape, arid and brown. It was then that we all realized we'd been exiled.
More than 6,000 people were exiled to Iaros alone, a small, uninhabited island in the Aegean. In the camp, which was already overcrowded, the inmates slept in tents or out in the open. There was hardly any food or water, and no medical care.
Everything on Hiaros was inhuman. Every day you said to yourself, I'm not going to make it. But the worst form of oppression is when they take away your freedom.
In Greece, there were countless prison islands like Iaros. Symbols of a deep schism which divided Greek society into nationalist-minded conservatives and an allegedly subversive left. It was a schism that had actually originated long before the regime of the colonels. On April the 6th, 1941, Greece was invaded by Hitler's Wehrmacht. The Nazi terror that followed claimed around 500,000 lives. Greece was systematically exploited and its infrastructure devastated. Right at the start of the German occupation, a communist-dominated resistance movement had formed. In the mountains, the partisans of the National Liberation Front engaged in bitter fighting against the Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS. In October 1944, Hitler's troops withdrew from Greece. The nation was ecstatic. But the euphoria of liberation was short-lived. The communists wanted to take over and refused to surrender their weapons. Fighting broke out time and again between them and the conservative supporters of the Greek monarchy. The onset of the Cold War also led to tension between the political camps. And in the north, Greece bordered on 3 Soviet satellite states: Albania, Yugoslavia, and Bulgaria. As early as 1944, the Greek Communist Party, the KKE, had declared its closeness to the Soviet Union. Conservatives and monarchists were afraid of Greece becoming another of Moscow's vassals. It was a fear shared by the Western allies. In their own interests, Winston Churchill and the United States supported the conservative forces in Greece, first and foremost militarily. In 1946, the conflict escalated. A devastating civil war broke out in which the Greek communists were backed by the Soviet Union. On remote islands like Iaros, the conservatives set up panel and re-education camps for communists. And anyone who refused to support the strict nationalism of the time was regarded as a traitor.
The underlying concept was that anyone who failed to gear their thoughts and actions and their everyday life to protecting their country had no place in that country. In Greece, patriotism became the all-important benchmark.
It wasn't until 1949 that the communists gave up and surrendered their weapons. The civil war was over, but not the conflict itself. In the mid-50s, the arch-conservative Konstantinos Karamanlis became prime minister of the new parliamentary monarchy. Under his aegis, a paramilitary state emerged which pursued a line of pure nationalism. Left-wing elements were systematically and aggressively persecuted.
Patriotism could only be one thing, anti-communist, and this justified all measures taken by the police. Everything was subordinate to it, even personal rights.
It was at this time that Karamanlis had the list of suspects drawn up, which the military junta of Papadopoulos, Patakos, and Makaresos fell back on a few years later. It was in this environment of state despotism that they took their first career steps, but they already knew one another from the past.
Papadopoulos and Makaresos were in the same class at military college and passed out together in 1940. Makaresos studied economics. Both men came from families which belonged to the elite of their villages, in the sense of priests or teachers.
For Patakos too, military college offered one of the few changes of escaping socially from his rural environment. The men who later became colonels understood the conditions in which most Greeks lived. In the 1950s, Greece was still a poor agricultural country that offered few perspectives. Tens of thousands of Greeks left their villages or emigrated. As in the rest of Europe, in the 60s, the youth of the country became politically involved and demanded greater freedom and democracy. This new generation regarded strict patriotism as totally outdated. But the arch-conservative military saw any form of liberalization as a threat. The result was demonstrations and street battles. It was in this charged atmosphere that a legislative election was scheduled for spring 1967. The favorite for the post of Prime Minister, Social Democrat Georgios Papandreou, promised political and social reforms. And he wanted to curb the influence of the king and the military. In conservative circles, such reform plans met with fierce resistance. The military leaders feared losing power, so they fell back on the plan for a coup which had already existed in secret for years. Its codename, Prometheus. Prometheus was basically a guide for gaining complete control of the capital, Athens, very quickly.
Prometheus was a NATO plan drawn up to determine operations in the case of a communist uprising. And the plotters of April the 21st, 1967, adhered to the plan.
In this way, the colonels forestalled the elections and toppled the Greek government in only one night. Georgios Papadopoulos had the coup celebrated as a national rescue operation. Greece, with newfound strength, founded on nationalism, Christian values and tradition.
Their slogan was Greece, the land of Christian Greeks. They were taking care of everything and had everything under control. We were supposed to go to work, but otherwise to keep our mouths shut. There was no sign of violence in everyday life. Some people had no objection to martial law being introduced or to the general ban on political parties. Neither were they disturbed by the ban on freedom of speech or Parliament being dissolved. The majority, however, were against all those things, yet they remained silent. People were afraid.
The regime also tried to control people's private lives. Anyone planning to invite guests to their home had to tell the police in advance. Many people were afraid of being denounced by their neighbors. Even an ordinary article of clothing could prove suspicious.
I saw my mother sitting next to my grandfather at a crossroads. She was wearing a bright red coat and said, "I won't get arrested on account of my coat, will I? Because they think I'm a communist."
With fear and mistrust spreading, the new military government celebrated Easter in media-effective style. The colonels knew what went down well and presented themselves as close to the people. Here, for instance, Stylianos Patakos and some soldiers are engaging in a traditional game played with eggs. The message here, Greece is an intact world where traditions are alive. Publicly, King Constantine placed himself at the service of the regime. But in reality, he had been stripped of power and was merely the junta's puppet. But in secret, he was planning to regain power. To achieve this, the king had placed his faith in elements of the armed forces that were loyal to him, but he underestimated his adversaries.
Colonel Papadopoulos had placed one of his commanders in nearly every key unit. He controlled the Navy, the task forces, the tank regiments, and also the Secret Service. There was nothing that could escape him. But it was these very units the king turned to for the counter-coup he had planned in December '67.
The counter-coup failed. The young king and his family had to leave the country and seek exile in Rome. The colonels now had free access to power. Papadopoulos seized the opportunity and appointed himself prime minister. He resigned from the army and exchanged his uniform for a tailcoat. Now he was a civilian and had secured the top position in his country. Nikolaos Makeresos donned the mantle of Minister of Economics and offered the prospect of a flourishing Greece. By contrast, Patakos, who was a fervent nationalist and had now become Minister of the Interior, promised to maintain national security, amongst other things by keeping a very close eye on opposition elements.
They came very early one morning. I was still in my nightdress. The guard said, "Get dressed, let's go down to the police station for a few minutes." Those few minutes turned into 3 years.
Secret Service employees placed a so-called declaration of loyalty in front of the then 21-year-old Georgia Papadopoulou.
If you've nothing to hide, they told her, then just sign here to confirm that you are loyal to our state. Afterwards, drop in, say, once a week, and let us know whether you've noticed anything different in your environment. Help us to shape this state.
An avowed Democrat, she refused and was kept in solitary confinement.
Basically, there were whole families who saw themselves as being left-wing. But the moment they signed the Declaration of Loyalty, they had reneged on all their beliefs and become traitors.
The door had a window in it. Someone was always watching you. There was also this lamp over the door. It was always on, day and night. I could never sleep. That lamp was a nightmare.
For 10 months, she was hardly ever allowed out of her cell. Constantly exposed to artificial light, her eyes became inflamed. Her hair fell out. Nevertheless, Georgia's family supported the young woman's decision.
My mother regarded my dignity as non-negotiable. She never once said, "Sign, then you can come home."
The young student was sentenced to 3 years in prison. But that wasn't all. Georgia's family was also subjected to repression. In 1967, foreign reporters managed to take these aerial photographs of the prison camp on the island of Iaros. The pictures went around the world and caused an uproar. Greece risked being expelled from the Council of Europe for serious violation of human rights. But before any such decision could be taken, the colonels withdrew from the organization of their own accord. Greece's crucial ally was NATO. The Hellenic Republic had been a full member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization since 1952. The late 60s saw radical political changes in the Mediterranean. In Libya, Muammar al-Gaddafi came to power in a military coup and established a socialist state. In the Six-Day War, Israel captured the Gaza Strip and the West Bank.
As a result of these events, the Middle East, indeed the entire Eastern Mediterranean, had assumed massive importance. So it was vital to have an alliance partner who stood firmly behind NATO. Any other matters could be discussed later.
Initially, the United States protested at the violent way the colonels had seized power and put military aid on hold. However, arms supplies recommenced only a few months later. In fact, Greece had become the second biggest recipient of military aid in the NATO alliance. On the streets of Europe, however, more and more people were protesting at Greece's military dictatorship, and they were supported by prominent figures like Greek actress Melina Mercouri, who at the time was living abroad. For denouncing the colonel's regime as fascist, she was stripped of her Greek citizenship and her property in Greece was confiscated. Despite international protests, the military government spoke of what it called the Greek race as the greatest and best under the sun. The colonels celebrated the anniversary of the coup with a mass spectacle. The procession portrayed ancient Greece in an absurdly exaggerated style, a dream of ancient greatness designed to show that Greece was powerful once again. The past served merely as a backdrop. Classical authors like Sophocles and Aristophanes were censored. In the motherland of philosophy, liberal thought was banned. Education no longer played a leading role. The focus was on manipulating the young and on unconditional obedience. On national holidays, the youth marched for the fatherland. The colonel's propaganda machine concealed the fact that the regime had no tangible political program. In the first few years, the colonels managed to present themselves as renovators. Economics Minister Makaresos pushed ahead with developing the country's infrastructure. Greek television constantly reported on the inauguration of new schools, railway stations and hospitals. Interior Minister Patakos played a particular role in this propaganda. As a result, the people called him the man with the trowel.
In the initial phase, let's say up to 1972, the colonels benefited in general from the buoyant state of the world economy, with many countries recording annual growth rates of 5 or 6%.
At the same time, the government placed its faith in the nascent tourism industry, increasing its investment in the sector by 600%. A construction boom began. In addition to gigantic hotel complexes, above all, it saw modern buildings going up in the capital, Athens. But public construction contracts were awarded primarily to favorites loyal to the party line. Even during the military dictatorship, Greece was still characterized by patronage, a deeply rooted system of old boy networks and nepotism.
Some systems were so entrenched that whenever a representative of the state appeared on the scene, some kind of donation was made, and people were glad when he'd gone.
In Greece, people didn't rely on the state for their personal advancement. Instead, they took matters into their own hands. Patronage was helpful provided you had the right contacts. That's why only a few profited from it. At the same time, the colonels promised that they would at last do away with this system of exclusive networks.
What is absurd is that after anti-communism, the first thing the junta turned to was downsizing the bureaucracy. They promised to do things like that, but never did.
While those in power were now enjoying life in the upper class to the full, all over the country, resistance movements were forming. In Thessaloniki, 20-year-old Triantafylos Mitaphides joined a group of resistance fighters called the Popular Struggle. In great secrecy, the group distributed flyers and unfurled banners on buildings in the city center, but their operations weren't always as harmless.
We also planted small explosive devices at places where the junta and their collaborators were active. But I must stress that we always made sure no civilians would be injured. We planted more than 1,000 bombs, but the only innocent victims were on our own side.
The bombs were intended as visible proof that people rejected the junta. On one of these operations, Mitaphides was captured by the security police. He was interrogated and tortured.
They used everything, from spontaneous beatings, where you were put in the middle and hurled to and fro, to systematic torture. That was the worst. Our legs were tied together at the ankles, and the soles of our feet beaten with a stick. They also used electric shocks.
Triantafylos Mitaphides refused to make any statement and was sentenced to life imprisonment. He was incarcerated in the infamous Gedikoulé prison in the Greek port of Thessaloniki. The aim there was to break political prisoners. Conditions in the jail were degrading.
The prison was notorious for its damp conditions. as a Red Cross delegation determined when it visited Yedikale. The cell floors and our blankets were completely soaked. In winter, there was no heating. All we had was a wood stove in which we burned anything we could get hold of.
While thousands of opponents of the regime were languishing in Greek prisons, more and more foreign tourists were enjoying life on the country's beaches. Holidaymakers came to Greece because of the ancient sites and its Mediterranean flair, and the personal freedoms they permitted themselves gave the country the veneer of a liberal society. Furthermore, television footage like this conveyed the impression of an economic boom. But in reality, this was only achieved with the help of loans. Hardly anything was produced by sustainable means. Finally, in the early 70s, the boom began to falter.
Suddenly, in 1972 and 73, Greece was registering an inflation rate of 15%. This seriously tarnished the economic successes which the junta had initially been able to present.
Discontent was growing. So was the desire for more freedom and self-determination, especially among the younger generation. In March 1973, students took to the streets, calling for democracy and respect for human rights.
The colonels branded the students leftists, communists and dangerous elements, but their parents knew that the students were not really organized in any left-wing spectrum. That earned the students' sympathy and gave rise to a new willingness to protest.
In the end, the mood in the country changed. Some elements of the armed forces, who had never backed the colonels, ventured a revolt. At the end of May 1973, the destroyer Velos withdrew from a NATO exercise without permission. With a full crew on board, it headed for Italy and was given permission to anchor off Fiumicino near Rome. Its captain, Nikos Papas, asked for political asylum for himself and his crew. He also called for a free Greece and a return to democracy. The captain's mutiny caused an international stir, and in Greece itself, the resistance shown by the navy undermined the power of Prime Minister Georgios Papadopoulos.
The naval protest showed that, in contrast to what Papadopoulos claimed, the military was not characterized by unity, but that politically it too was fragmented.
Pushed into a corner, Papadopoulos took the bull by the horns. He promised elections. Martial law was lifted and press censorship eased, while political prisoners were granted amnesty. Among those freed were Democrat Georgia Papadopoulou and resistance fighter Triantafylos Mitafidis. Prime Minister Papadopoulos desperately tried to preserve his authority. In September 1973, he had himself sworn in as Viceroy, and in doing so provoked even more resistance. On November the 14th, 1973, thousands of students occupied the Technical University of Athens, chanting, "Bread, education, freedom." Among them was Stefanos Tsoumakas.
We were resolute. It was now or never. 6 years of dictatorship were enough. We didn't want a seventh.
Over the next 2 days, more and more people showed solidarity with the students. Food and blankets were smuggled into the campus. On the streets in front of the university, there was turmoil as protesters clashed with police.
Then the regime decided to act. They had snipers fire into the crowd.
More and more young people were wounded. The situation escalated.
When we heard that tanks were coming, we knew now it's do or die.
During the night, the tanks besieged the campus. In desperation, the students radioed the advancing military.
Είμαστε άοπλοι. Είμαστε άοπλοι. Αδέλφια μας στρατιώτες, δεν θα σηκώσετε όπλο. Δεν θα σηκώσετε και δεν θα πυροβολήσετε. Δεν θα σκοτώσετε τα αδέλφια σας.
And then they attacked.
On the morning of November 17, the gates to the university were flattened by a tank. Those who couldn't flee were arrested. Tsoumakis managed to go underground. "26 people lost their lives in the three-day uprising. The violence shocked the entire country and also caused serious division among the colonels. Some of the military blamed Prime Minister Papadopoulos for the escalation. His biggest adversary was a man who, up to that point, had been active in the background, Dimitrios Ioannidis. Ioannidis grabbed the opportunity to oust Papadopoulos. Now the military dictatorship was headed by the man in charge of the notorious military police and the torture prisons.
The time of terror began, which was more brutal than ever before.
A new wave of arrests swept the country. Martial law was reintroduced. To divert attention from Greece's growing domestic problems, Ioannidis focused on foreign policy and in particular on Cyprus. Greece shares a century-old history with this island off the coast of Turkey. After the First World War, Cyprus was annexed by Great Britain. It was not until 1960 that the island was granted independence. Turkey insisted that this status be upheld. But in Greece, the possible annexation of Cyprus was seen as the reconquest of territory that was historically Greek, something Dimitrios Ioannidis also drew on.
Ioannidis wanted to achieve something impressive, something that could enhance his standing in the country. So he staged a coup against the government of Archbishop Makarios and replaced it with one which he controlled. But that was a totally absurd move. It was wrong, disastrous, and stupid.
Only July 20, 1974, Ankara intervened. Turkish troops occupied the northern part of the island. It was the beginning of the end for the regime of the colonels. Because not only were the Cypriots and the people of Greece shocked, the Greek military was also horrified.
With no arms, uniforms, even boots, there was no way Greece could go to war with Turkey. A large number of officers who had been dismissed because of their democratic views were now being called up again. As a result, entire units were being formed which were opposed to the regime.
When Dimitrios Ioannidis demanded that more troops be sent to Cyprus, his commanders refused.
It was the Cyprus conflict which triggered the fall of the dictatorship, not resistance, nor the trench warfare within the regime. The Cyprus crisis, which the military itself had created, finally forced the colonels to surrender power.
Events now developed rapidly. In an arbitrary act, on July 23, 1974, naval officers declared that the regime of the colonels was over, and Greece hoped for a return to democracy.
The joy was indescribable. It felt like someone had opened all the doors and windows. You could see the horizon again.
But the sense of relief was short-lived. The very next night, former Prime Minister Konstantinos Karamanlis returned from exile and took up the reins of government. He, of all people, the arch-reactionary monarchist who in the 1950s had fought the left with everything in his power.
When Karamanlis came back, we thought, we have achieved absolutely nothing.
However, the once ultra-conservative Karamanlis was a different person. In exile in Paris, he had got to know democratic Europe.
He came back with two goals: to oust the military from political life and to dissolve the monarchy.
Karamanlis took a momentous decision. He legalized the Communist Party, the KKE, and in doing so overcame the deep division between the conservatives and the left, which up to then had been criminalized. On November 17, 1974, the anniversary of the student uprising, free and democratic elections took place. Karamanlis was elected prime minister. Karamanlis also allowed the people to vote on the future form of government. From his base in exile, King Constantine II sought support for a monarchy. But the Greeks had never forgiven his role in the military coup 7 years previously. They decided against a monarchy and voted in favor of a parliamentary democracy.
We had finally managed to secure social and political rights, something that had never been achieved before.
In Athens, the leaders of the military dictatorship were put on trial. Makaresos, Patakos and Papadopoulos were found guilty of treason and sentenced to death. Ioannidis was given life imprisonment, but Prime Minister Karamanlis had the death sentences commuted. He wanted to send a signal: democracy instead of violence. For the first time since antiquity, Greece had a stable democratic system.
I think the dictatorship was of tremendous importance in the history of Greece. It was necessary to stop dissenters being demonized, because before then, every non-conservative political opponent had been regarded as a traitor.
Today, there's a broad spectrum of parties in the Greek parliament. The division of society into left-wing traitors and patriotic conservatives seems to have been overcome.
It is one of the ironies of fate that the military dictatorship proved to be a unifying element for Greek society, because the people came together to reject it. The majority agreed that the dictatorship was unacceptable.
In 1989, in a symbolic act, lists containing the names of opposition members were burned. Henceforth, no one was to be persecuted for their political beliefs. It was a cross-party resolution which had created an insoluble dilemma, because the years of the dictatorship could no longer be fully worked through, and they still have an effect today.
On a political level, a hypersensitivity towards government action is perhaps still perceptible. There is serious mistrust.
The division of Cyprus still stands as stark reminder of the regime of the colonels. Today, Greece's democracy is again under pressure. The country is facing huge economic problems. As a result, right-wing reactionary forces are gathering strength. Many people are afraid of Greece becoming an authoritarian state once more. Preventing this and solving the country's economic problems once and for all will be the greatest challenge for the future.